How does someone kill again and again across the United States for decades and remain largely invisible? Not because they were careful, not because they were brilliant, but because no one was looking in the right places. Samuel Little would eventually confess to 93 killings across 19 states, making him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Yet for more than 40 years, he moved freely through cities and towns while his victims were misclassified, overlooked, or forgotten. And what finally exposed him wasn't a witness, it was science catching up. For decades, Samuel Little drifted across the country. He rarely stayed in one place. He lived on the margins, and he encountered police again and again, without ever being connected to the crimes that defined his life. Between the early 1970s and 2005, Little moved through nearly every region of the United States. During that time, law enforcement would later determine he was responsible for dozens of deaths, many of which were never initially treated as homicides. At the time, no one saw a pattern. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1970, in Reynolds, Georgia. He later said his mother was too young to care for him, and he was raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. His childhood was unstable, and by his teenage years, he had already begun a life of crime. He dropped out of high school and cycled in and out of juvenile detention. As an adult, his criminal record expanded to include theft, fraud, driving offenses, and repeated arrests for minor crimes. By the mid-1970s, he had been arrested more than 25 times in 11 different states. Yet despite constant contact with the justice system, the most serious acts he committed went undetected. Little's transient lifestyle made him difficult to track, but that alone doesn't explain how he remained invisible for so long. What mattered just as much was how his victims were seen. Many of the deaths later attributed to him were initially classified as overdoses, accidents, deaths from natural causes. In several cases, bodies were never recovered at all. Without obvious signs of violence and with limited forensic tools available at the time, investigators had little reason to suspect homicide, and that blind spot would protect him for decades. In 2012, Samuel Little was living at a shelter in Kentucky when he was arrested on an outstanding charge in California related to illegal substances. Once in custody, investigators conducted a DNA test. That test linked him to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles County from the late 1980s. For the first time, his crimes were undeniable. In 2014, a jury found him responsible for those killings, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. But the DNA match did something else. It opened the door to a far larger truth. The Los Angeles Police Department contacted the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP. As analysts reviewed Little's movements, arrest history, and timelines, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that stretched back decades and across state lines. Texas Ranger James Holland and FBI investigators conducted extensive interviews with Little, and slowly, the picture expanded. Little began confessing. Over time, Samuel Little admitted responsibility for 93 killings committed between 1970 and 2005. Law enforcement agencies have since determined that more than 60 of those cases are credible and supported by evidence, including DNA, location matches, and corroborating records. Investigators continue to work to confirm additional cases. What made this process possible was not just science, but Little's own memory. Little had an unusually strong memory for faces and details. During interviews, he provided investigators with names, locations, and timeline, and in some cases drew portraits of victims from memory. Those sketches were shared publicly by the FBI. For some families, they became the first recognition of a loved one who had vanished years earlier. For investigators, they became a bridge between confession and confirmation. According to law enforcement, Little primarily targeted individuals who were socially and economically vulnerable. Many struggled with housing insecurity. Some battled substance use. Others lived transient lives with limited support systems. A significant number of victims were women of color. Because of this, their deaths often received little attention at the time, and disappearances were not always immediately reported or investigated. That reality played a crucial role in how long Little was able to operate undetected. Little encountered police repeatedly throughout his life. He was arrested, charged, and incarcerated multiple times, sometimes after violent incidents. Yet plea deals, reduced charges, and limited information sharing meant he was often released back into the community. Each missed connection allowed the pattern to continue, not because the evidence didn't exist, but because it was never connected. In his final year, Samuel Little continued cooperating with investigators from prison, helping clarify timelines and locations. He died on December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80, in a hospital outside the California prison where he was serving his sentence. His death ended his direct involvement, but the investigation did not end with him.